Hello, and welcome to the Fresh Perspectives podcast, where our intention is growing together and leading with love. I'm Peter Callahan, and I believe we each have incredible capacity to continue to learn and evolve as individuals and as a species, and bring way more love and a lot less fear into the world and our daily lives. Changing can be hard. And I've found that even if nothing changes, having the courage to see our challenges from a fresh perspective can change everything. I'm glad you're here. And I am so glad to be connecting today with my friend and colleague, Dr. Vamsi Koneru. Vamsi is a PhD clinical psychologist in private practice at Koneru Psychotherapy, LLC, where he focuses on the intersection of trauma and mindfulness, which we'll be talking about today. And he really specializes in providing compassionate, evidence-based psychotherapy for adolescents, adults, and families. Vamsi is also a certified mindfulness teacher with the Engaged Mindfulness Institute. Dr. Koneru is also a passionate social activist and focuses his work on the intersection of the carceral system and mental health. And he volunteers with Stop Solitary CT, an organization that aims to end the use of solitary confinement in jails, detention centers, and prisons across Connecticut, replacing it with humane, safe, and effective alternatives, as well as serving on the forensic counseling team at community mental health affiliates, where he provides individual therapy for individuals who have been diverted from or recently discharged from incarceration. And Vamsi is an enthusiastic teacher and serves as an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine, as well as with the Copper Beech Institute. Dr. Koneru completed his MS and PhD at the University of Miami, his clinical internship at the Yale University School of Medicine, and his postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard Medical School, VA Boston Healthcare System. And Vamsi brings that wealth of experience into our conversation today. And actually, we grew up in the same town together. We'll discuss. And Vamsi talks about the experiences in his life growing up with parents who immigrated from India to this country and led him to these lenses that he now uses of psychology, mindfulness, and trauma, and really gives us some seriously fresh perspectives on how to identify and potentially work with our experiences of trauma, preferably with the support of a trained professional. And because our time was a bit short today, as your ERS reference, we had a lot more we wanted to discuss. But one of the topics that we didn't get to talk about that I'm hoping to discuss in later episodes is this idea of historical trauma. The idea that most, if not all of us, are living with some degree of trauma that has been passed down through multiple generations, that may be having far more impact on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors than we're even able to yet understand. So just love to acknowledge that historical trauma piece as well. But so grateful to Vamsi for joining me for this conversation. Please keep it here. Wonderful. It's great to be with you. Thanks for being here today, Vamsi.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, it's always a gift to be with you.
And maybe for my sake in recording your introduction and for listeners, maybe you could pronounce your full name for us from
Oh,
your...
of course. Yeah. So my first name is Vamsi and last name is Koneru, like canary, like the bird, but an U at the end, Koneru. Yes.
Canary like the bird. I've heard you say that enough times that
Yes.
I think I'm getting it down now. So that's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you for being here, Vamsi. It's such an honor. I know we've had many conversations over our years connected through the Copper Beech Institute in West Hartford. And were you a founding board member or just after?
Just after, yeah. So I was in the MBSR training and then a current board member and I became friendly and friends and we're chatting. And he said, Copper Beech seems to be looking for a few new board members, I think generally, and then maybe wanting to add maybe a deeper presence of mental health providers or sort of that perspective. And so he asked sort of from multiple perspectives. So I joined in 2014 as a board member of Copper Beach. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I know you did your 6 years, right? Had the full term.
That's right.
Yes, it was a
That's right.
sad day when you were leaving, as you were a big part of my journey there at Copper Beach. And you referenced, I'm just always attuned to MBSR, which we have certainly talked about if anyone's listened to previous episodes, but that is mindfulness based stress reduction, faithfully known as MBSR, the 8-week course created by John Kabat-Zinn that maybe we'll get into a little bit more. But to start, as we were just referencing before we start recording, I'd love
Yeah.
to just let folks get to know you a little bit more. And, for my own sake, I always love things that come up in this question, understanding how you got into this world. So as a psychologist who specializes in trauma and mindfulness. And yeah, I'm just curious to hear too, as your journey and even maybe your parents, but I'd love to, if you're up for starting there, and just any moments that you feel like helped you recognize your interest in human behavior and the human mind and trauma and mindfulness specifically would be great.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I love how you include my parents and sort of this intergenerational idea, because whenever I'm asked to introduce myself, I'm often starting there. First, if I've been able to engage with people or connect with people in my professional role or personal role, I think it's largely a function of having the love and wisdom and guidance of Prasad and Lakshmi Koneru, wonderful parents, amazing, amazing, amazing people. I've been reflecting more and more on that, to be honest, their journey. And I'm still kind of piecing the story together with my mom. My father, unfortunately, passed a fair while ago in 2001, sadly, but thinking about just like the ideas of trust that probably will come up, and I know has come up various times when we speak, but trust, bravery, courage, like that, hopefully we try to embody. When I think about them deciding to take this leap of faith, with my father had his medical training, but finished his residency and sort of some additional training here in the state, but they decided to leave in 1976. So with the 2-year-old in tow, my older brother headed to the United States. And then in 1978 in Massachusetts, I joined the fray. We jokingly say in the Koneru sort of lore, when we moved to Falmouth in 1980, the 4 of us quadrupled the Indian population of Falmouth, becoming the 4 Indian people in the town. It came with a lot of benefit, I think, though. It's a lovely community, as we've spoken about our connections to the Cape. But Falmouth it's a lovely town, very thoughtful, liberal, progressive community. And then being the son of one of the 3 anesthesiologists in the whole town, and son of the Indian physician, if you will. It's like, oh, you're Dr. Canaris, come to the front of the line. Like, we left him. He took care of my sister. But I mentioned that because just one of the consistent elements that I heard about him and my mom was just this love that they conveyed. My dad, when people would speak about him, would say like, oh my God, like I was so nervous about my surgery, or my daughter was so nervous about having this happen. Then your dad came in. It was just very soothing. He kind of joked around. He set us at ease. And then all of a sudden I was waking up from the surgery, and I heard stories like that over and over and over again. So I mentioned this also because the word story is so relevant for me. When I was growing up, I just always found myself loving story, loved going to the library and listening to stories, loved going to the bookshop, listening to stories. I loved reading. In our household, there was sort of a requirement, like you always had to be in the midst of some kind of book. As I got a little bit older, I would read these Spencer mystery novels only because my dad would read them in about a day. Then my brother would read them in a week. And then it would take me maybe a month or so. And I would read these. And after 5 or 6 or 7 of them, I went to my dad. I was like, they kind of all feel pretty similar, Dad. Like, X happens, Y happens, the mystery is solved. He's like, yeah, that's, why we can read them pretty quickly. They're just enjoyable books. But I was telling him, like, I really enjoy when Spencer, the detective, when he's speaking with his wife, or when he and his friends are chatting, when you learn about him. And so as a young kid, I started noting I was just very interested in people's stories. What motivated this character to do what they did? Why were they upset in that relationship? What resulted in that? These kinds of questions would come up. And I always found those parts of the book most intriguing, and getting to know who this character was. And as I was a young kid, my dad said, there are these books written called biographies. He introduced me to this whole concept of biography. And it was actually quite revelatory for me. I was like, oh my God, a whole book where I get to learn about this person's story. That's amazing. So I forget even at what age, but young, and they had these little charming little books, like kind of an abridged version of, Einstein's biography and this person's biography. So I just started reading them, and I just found just would consume them because they were just so enjoyable to read from. And so I think that's what started getting me all the more interested in just the sense of story and narrative and a person's story and their development and this idea of biography and what makes up a story. And then I always was very interested in science. And then the third piece I often will say when I think about like my professional development and what sort of led me to do a lot of what I do is that as a kid, I found myself always hearing about this thing that people would go to, and they always look kind of downtrodden, upset. And they'd be like, "Oh, I got to go to work. I've got to go to work." And I'm like, what
Mm.
is this? This is awful. Like, look at these people's expression. So I jokingly, but not so jokingly say probably a lot of my early life, and maybe in some ways continues to be like a quality of my mission is to not be overly engaged in what feels like work. If it feels overly laborious, then I really try to observe like what's happening here. Is there some incongruence between my actions and my values in this
Mm.
moment? Because more often than not, I tend to find a sense of congruence. Not to say, obviously, at times things can be very challenging. Like as a psychologist, listening to some of the things that people bring up, especially in the context of trauma, which we'll talk about, of course. But it doesn't feel like work. It feels like I feel quite honored actually most of the time getting to hear people's stories and hear people share what they're able to and comfortable to share as our relationship develops. So this blending of story, science, and then this kind of joking, but not so joking again, sort of wanting to pursue and find a path that didn't feel too laborious, too much like work, were kind of the driving elements. As a senior in high school, I took a course in psychology for the first time, never met a psychologist. There weren't any psychologists within our familial community. Took a psychology course, I want to say for something more heroic, but probably because somebody told me, oh, you get an easy A in the course, probably something like that as a senior. But I took the course and I was like, this is it.
Mm.
And it hit me sort of as a senior in high school. I was like, this is putting together all of the pieces for me. Psychology, the study of human behavior, the study of motivation, trying to really foster that sense of curiosity about people. It all seemed to play out within this realm. So then from there was pretty set on studying psychology as an undergrad, pursued psychology. Wasn't quite sure if I would go into like maybe medical school, was intrigued by psychiatry and neurology. So I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with it yet, but I just knew this was kind of the field that spoke to me well. As a junior, became all the more interested in studying in a more formal way literature. So started studying American literature at the same time. I mentioned that just because when I graduated, then I wasn't quite sure which way to go. I was sort of torn, like, should I go this way towards psychology, which has spoken to me? Should I go this way? So being uncertain kind of pulled on some of my more active and activism kind of orientation. I pursued the Peace Corps. I lived in Ecuador for a while and worked there. And then following that experience, it felt more crystallized that I think psychology was the space for me. It felt like it brought together all of these elements as well as nurtured more so the kind of active and activism sort of orientation. And so I came back from Peace Corps and worked in a psychiatric hospital for a couple of years. And I mentioned that because that was actually a time of deep formation. A mentor really helped me to think about what path I ought to pursue, how to do this most effectively, because I was thinking about maybe some mixture of family therapy. I was very intrigued by family therapy, seeing families in a waiting room. And I didn't know anything about family therapy at this time, but just seeing families together, seeing them provide this support to one another, beginning to like kind of become tearful because we were working with the kids at that time. And so we'd kind of whisk the child away for a little while, an hour or two, interview them, do some different activities. But the parents would form this makeshift group, what seemed like. And so I started to see there's something there. I don't know exactly what's happening, but something is there. So I began to think about family therapy, clinical psychology. So I presented this idea to a mentor at that time, I think I'm going to get a LMFT or a licensed marriage and family therapy degree. Then I'm going to pursue a PhD because I'm very interested in research. And one of the things, and I think for all of us, we think back to our teachers and mentors at that time, he looked at me like with very warm eyes, a very tender heart. And he said, "That's amazing. And here's what you're going to do." And so he told me, he's like, "You're going to find a mentor in graduate school in clinical psychology that focuses on family and family therapy. And you're going to pursue that, just providing me a much more linear trajectory, a much more kind of parsimonious solution to things." And so I continue to think back to him. And oftentimes now I'm very eager and enthusiastic about mentoring because he really helped me to kind of just clarify my course. I had a sense of what I wanted to do, but there are many, many pathways within psychology. So it can be challenging for people to figure out exactly the best way. So he was very helpful in that. So from there, I went to Miami and pursued a PhD in psychology, completed my training there. And from there, did some additional training as an intern and a postdoc for a while. I cut my teeth in community mental health. I feel like my heart still sort of resides in community mental health, but where the pieces of more the intersections of mindfulness and trauma come in is that as a fourth year graduate student, I was introduced to a type of therapy called dialectical behavior therapy, and DBT, or dialectical behavior therapy, is one of the more I find more forward thinking models when it comes to mindfulness. It was one of the first that in a very empirical way brought in mindfulness. I didn't really know what this was as a fourth year. I was kind of like, what is this? Am I doing this right? And as I practiced individually and started, I think, having all of the questions that we tend to as early practitioners: am I doing this right? Is this what it is? Is my mind supposed to be wandering this much? I must be doing this wrong because my mind is wandering so much, so on and so forth. So pursued individually for a while, but again, sort of bringing the arm of science in was an on-ramp for me. So the work of various people, including like Dan Siegel, for example, was very helpful for me to feel like there's like a there, like something was happening.
Hmm.
And not to say that's necessary for many folks, but for me, it provided a kind of on-ramp and scaffolding to appreciate like that something's occurring here. It gave me sort of some elements of motivation. And then from there, I felt like I wanted to pursue it all the more deeply. I was like, I think this is something very, very meaningful. And as we were talking about at the beginning, the letters MBSR kept coming up, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And I was like, I think I need to take this course, but how am I going to get to Worcester? I live in Connecticut. I need to go to UMass. How am I going to do this? I have a family. So I researched it, and I was like, look at that. MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, is being offered at a place I've never heard of, Copper Beech Institute. And so that was my inroad or on ramp into the Copper Beech Institute as well. And I did the 8-week training there, and then became a board member and sort of continued to more deeply pursue mindfulness. The trauma piece came in as a postdoc where I had one of my first patients. And I want to throw it back to you, but the trauma piece came in. One of my first patients, when I began speaking with him, said, since I've been home, I'm just not the same. I didn't really know a lot about trauma at this point, but that sentiment just really touched me in a particular way. Maybe it was the timing of it, how he said it, just the genuineness of it, the authenticity of it, helped me to begin thinking like, wow, like, what does that mean? And I don't know that I had a particularly cogent answer at that point, but it started me sort of wanting to investigate more. What does he mean? And he was a great teacher of his in sharing the story of his experience to help me really begin to think about, what is the experience of trauma? What are the effects of trauma? And then the last piece of just the intersection of the two was when I was working in a community mental health agency as one of my positions. And I had a wonderful teacher, a patient that I got to work with. We'll call her Emily. And just a long story short, I was very interested in mindfulness and trauma, but it really hadn't begun to more deeply make connections between the two, kind of a trauma-informed mindfulness perspective, which we can talk about a little bit more. But they were two somewhat separate, or I thought, oh, we can offer sort of mindfulness practice to individuals, and I think it will be helpful. I began speaking with her and said, I've gotten more and more into this idea of mindfulness and the practices of mindfulness and what this is. And at that point, my practice was very tethered to like a mindfulness of the breath practice, where, as you know, but for listeners that may be less familiar, we're attending to an object of attention, in this case, the breath, just coming in and out of the body. So I gave her a little introduction to it. I said, what do you think? Would you be open to sharing in a practice? She said, sure, Vamsi, I'll give it a try. We did a maybe brief practice, 2 or 3 minutes. And at the end of it, she opened her eyes and looked at me and she said, I don't think I'm into this breathing shit, Dr. K. You're just an amazing, amazing teacher that helped me begin seeing that mindfulness of the breath is simply a practice. It's simply a doorway into this sort of room of mindfulness, not the doorway. And so the intersection of all of these different pieces, but those couple of folks, one, the patient during my postdoc, and then Emily, wonderful teachers that really helped me to put these different ideas that felt somewhat disparate, but that I was trying to work with, really helped me to create a little bit more of a coherent lens, coherent set of intersections between these ideas.
Coherent lens.
Yeah.
Yes. Wow. That was a very coherent journey you just took us on too, Wamsi. Thank you. It was, yeah, I just felt fully in it with you. And as always, what I love about getting to do this is I just learned 3 or 4 things that I'm not sure, had ever come up in our many conversations before. So I'm so grateful for that. And yeah, there's just so many wonderful pieces. I love one of the things I would just want to reflect on is the degree to which you've reflected on your own journey and your story, and to be able to sort of so succinctly, maybe 10 or 12 minutes doesn't feel succinct on some level, but you just took us through 40 years of life in a way that
Mhm.
to me was very engaging and trackable. And it's so interesting how you've been able to weave some pieces of those early experiences. I love hearing you talk about how much storytelling drew you in, and then specifically your interest in people. And that's
Mhm.
certainly something we share. And probably in a way, that helped me see my own curiosity in a way that I haven't before, Wamsi. So I really appreciate that. Of like, oh yeah, there's just something about hearing people's stories that isn't, I hope, is sort of a basic human trait on some level. But either way, I know many folks don't find as much curiosity or interest in that, which is okay. It's just, I'm grateful to want to hold that space and to just really feel the mutual benefit of getting to both
Mhm.
listen to and share each other's stories. And it's really, so thank you for sharing yours. It's such an honor. And
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.
I could ask about 10 more questions that I wanted to fill in some more gaps and curiosity in there. And maybe just one that keeps it's sort of nagging at me in the back of my mind. So I'll bring it up in this idea of, research is often me search folks speak to,
Mm.
so especially those who are piled higher and deeper, such as yourself, getting a PhD. And there is the irony too that my dad happened to be a PhD in Falmouth at the time that you were describing. So Wamsi and I met here in Connecticut. Turns out we both went to Falmouth High School in Massachusetts, and that's just such a at only a few years apart. We just
Sure.
missed each other basically. It's just fascinating the way life works.
Yeah. It's wild, wild.
Yes, it's so wonderful that your dad. I didn't know any of the Konerus, so I didn't get to be put out by your dad.
Mhm.
But however you might say that more professionally. But the other one point that I do just want to touch on before we go to the next question, Wamsi, and I'll let you respond if there's
Yeah,
anything
please.
else, is just this idea, because I love your 3 pieces that you spoke to. I didn't label them well in my notes, but learning, like, story, learning about people, and then not being overly engaged in this burden that is work. And I just
Yeah.
love that. I felt that way about school in many ways. I feel like a voracious learner now. Feel like in many ways I've done much more learning since I graduated college than all those years in formal education. But I love this idea. And one of the things I think I have mentioned previously is doing my best in life. And I think you were speaking to this really well, of exchanging anytime I feel the word work coming up in myself, because I love to work hard. I find it very rewarding and meaningful when I'm connected to why I'm doing it, as you described. And
Yeah.
I love the practice of noticing how I'm relating to something that may be work and seeing if I can exchange that word work for play as
Mhm.
often as possible in life. And so I really appreciate, as you described it, someone might say, oh, well, this person's just lazy. He just doesn't want to work hard. And everything I know about you, that could not be further from the truth. So you have 3 children that it's not you can't possibly be, you don't have the option to be
Just
lazy. It's really not on the table. So let alone your own psychology practice and all the training and continuing education you've done. And so anyway, yeah, does anything come up for you in there before we dive into trauma maybe a
I
little
think
more?
yeah, I think you bring up, really important points that, yeah, this isn't about trying to escape or disconnect, or as you're saying, right, like not in any kind of quality of avoidance, right? That's this idea of when something feels like work for me, as we're sort of reiterating, it's that idea that I think there's some sense of incongruence, in DBT, we're often looking for effectiveness and congruence. And are you living a life that's consistent and congruent with your values? And sometimes we need clarification on what our values are, not to say they're static by any means. These are evolving qualities as well. But
Yes.
just that I take it almost like a mindfulness bell, if you will. Sometimes to begin and close a practice, somebody will ring just a gentle bell, but it's sort of this reminder to familiarize, to be awake, to be attentive. And so I take that sense of like the emotional feel of if it feels like work, almost kind of as a meditation bell, like, attend to this, sort of engage with this in such a way, open your eyes, open your heart a little bit more as to why is that? Yeah, not in any way, hopefully not to escape or avoid, but maybe even to delve more deeply into it in different ways, or maybe more nuanced ways, maybe ways that again feel like how I want to approach it, how it feels a sense of an evolving relationship with something.
Yes, absolutely,
Yeah.
Mumsy.
And then the other word that just comes to mind consistently for me, and I was just saying it today, was to a potential person I may work with in the future, let's say, but the word practice, that I used to, in a lot of our textbooks and stuff, will say, like, remember to be working with homework, work with your patients on homework so that the work is done. Like, I don't know that I want to be doing homework. I don't know that most people want to be doing homework. Of course, again, like, so I simply call it practice. Like we're trying to bring the practice that we're engaging in the session into the practice of life. And then, so when I think about a lot of things, I simply think of life as an unfolding practice. That's where how I think about, meditation and mindfulness coming off the cushion, so to speak. It's just an unfolding practice that there's nothing privileged about the sitting, if you will. Like that's not the practice. It's simply that's how the practice is manifesting in that moment. But I try to bring the same energy and attention and sort of awareness, and sort of I think of mindfulness as kind of a loving awareness and a very engaged and active awareness. I try to bring that, if you will, with me to the cushion when I sit down, and then I hope it travels with me off the cushion out into this ongoing and unfolding practice. So that word practice is one that I hold very dearly as well.
Me too, Mumsy. Me too. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And I love
Yeah.
the practice that you just described of noticing when you're relating to something with some tension or constriction as work. And you don't have to stop and sit down and follow your breath. To your point, that's one doorway that's probably not appropriate in most moments when you're working in the midst of work. Sometimes, sure, but to
Yeah.
recognize it's a practice to, and one of the translations for mindfulness is remember. It's a practice to remember,
Mm.
this is something that comes up in me, and maybe, maybe we call it a challenge or an opportunity to then practice and see, all right, how can I more deeply understand this, and what room might there be to practice relating to this a little bit different. That's so much of the work
Yes.
I do in coaching with people I get to work with. Okay, this is coming up. That's okay. It's understandable. Your work might be, let's understand how this came to be, where, and that's can be more therapy. Obviously, if we're both doing a good job, there's some aspects of each of our work and each other's, but we have different training. And then for me, it's let's take this forward, acknowledging that this is a reality that I'm facing. This is part of who I am. How do I want to work with this going forward? What's the next right
Mm,
step for me to begin
mm,
to heal and grow and choose another step? And so maybe this is a good transition too for understanding trauma, because
mm.
the word is used often now. I think people have heard, as you referenced me, PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, is one of the ways I certainly heard about it first in the last 20 years or so. And yet there's been so much more around it. And maybe just to start, I'm curious to hear how you might define trauma, how you understand it in the most layman's terms. Not all of us have a PhD, so please go easy on us. Thank you.
I think you bring up a number of important points, right? That for most individuals, they probably heard that configuration of letters, right? PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, and I'm thankful that a lot of people, when they hear those letters, they're like, "Oh yeah, yeah, I've heard of that," right?
It's a real thing.
I think one of the limits, it's a real thing, right? And it's pervasive, and people do experience it, and it's certainly something that has to be held with a lot of respect and reverence, not simply those letters, but the idea that there's acknowledgement of it. This has been a sort of psychological and psychiatric journey for our various professions as well, to get to a place where it is acknowledged also beyond something that soldiers experience exclusively.
Yes.
So we're still in this ongoing journey. But to begin, one of the definitions that really resonates with me comes from the National Traumatic Stress Network and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. It's a 3E definition. And what I like about this is it thinks about the event, the experience, and the effects. We often think about trauma as it's described as like, this is a traumatic event. And that's the trauma, like the earthquake or the migration or the unfortunate occurrence that occurred perhaps between two people, some type of abuse. And it is not to in any way to minimize or discard that. It is simply to say that that event in and of itself is not the trauma. It's really the experience of that. How did that affect me psychologically? How did that affect me socially? How did that affect me emotionally? Because let's take migration, for example. For some people, that could be an incredibly traumatic event. For my parents, it was not. It was moving to something where they felt like this is what we want to move towards, sort of this quote unquote American dream. For other people, due to various other circumstances, that same experience could be quite traumatic because the event itself, the migration, has deep emotional and psychological, it is experienced in deeply maybe painful or distressing psychological, social, emotional ways. And then the effects of it. What are the lasting sort of adverse effects of the event and the experience? So this 3E definition, I think, helps us to think about trauma as not bound to the event, really taking it to the individual, the group, or the community, and the effects of it, the experience of it, and then the lasting effects of it.
Thank
So that helps me to organize when I'm thinking about individual, group, social, community level trauma. Like what happened, of course, is relevant. A key question we often ask is like, what happened to you, right? We try to shift from this mindset of pathology, like what's wrong with you, to what happened to you. And that I think is a very governing question in a lot of the work that we try to do as probably most of us in our fields. If you're relating to human beings, if we can create a lens of fundamentally, to me, I hear it like, what's your story? Like what's unfolded in your life? What happened to you?
Right.
Right. As opposed to the psychopathological lens, we often think about a lot of terms like, what are the symptoms? What's wrong with you? So that's how I think about trauma, how I try to conceptualize it. And I use it as a way to open, I guess, the process of trying to really listen to and perhaps assist and support in the storytelling and kind of like the assembly, or to support somebody in trying to create a sense of a narrative, as opposed to oftentimes in trauma, individual stories become quite fragmented. And, there are various sort of reasons for that, but just it's the memory of trauma due to the effects of trauma can leave a very kind of jagged representation, or kind of just pieces or shards or splinters of a story. And I think our jobs really is in the relationship of psychotherapy, perhaps coaching as well, perhaps in various other domains, is to simply assist people first and foremost to try to help put some of those splinters or shards of that story together over time. Not to say we dive right into that. For some people that may not be available or accessible. Some of the work is helping people develop and practice different skills that helps them to manage, again, the effects of trauma. So they might really struggle with emotion management, stress management, relational management, engaging in things because of the compromised safety they felt. So the work might be very much hinged and built on a foundation of developing various skills to support that. And then if individuals feel equipped and in a way ready, and via the relationship, the psychotherapeutic relationship, we feel like it could be useful to really construct and sort of recreate that sense of a cogent and coherent narrative for that person, so they feel like they have an autobiographical narrative to organize their lives,
Yeah.
is often a significant part of the work as well.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. That makes sense. So creating that story, and I've heard, and maybe I'll come back to this in a moment. Actually, the remote control can be one storytelling
Mm.
tool that I've heard of. But just to touch on So to clarify, because I really appreciate your definition in these three E's of event, experience, and effect. And one of the things that really helped me understand this was is that two people could be standing next to each other, witness the same atrocity. Maybe you're both standing in a window and you watch 9/11 occur, right? And these buildings fall and people jumping in them. And then one person could have a very different experience and experience much different effects long term from that than the person standing next to them. Not that it, you know, it can have so many different impacts on us, right? And I liked your point from your story earlier. That person came back, they said they don't feel the same. Like I am now relating to most of my life differently. And that can lead to all these behaviors. And I love this question instead of what's wrong with you. And this really helps me simply to reduce my road rage at times, right? Someone does
Mm,
something, cuts me off. My mind is trained to go to what's wrong with you. That's not how to behave in our culture. Whereas I can now notice that come up and shift that question to ask, "Oh, what's happened to you? How's your day going today? Please go." Often I can cultivate now some generosity, like, "Sorry, you're having a tough time. Please go for it. I know you didn't mean to." Other times, I still just want to lift up a single finger, but I'm doing better. It's getting better. And I know for the sake of time, Lindsay, there's so much more to unpack here and get into maybe for another conversation. But I'm almost thinking of maybe just leaving folks with some more practical tips. And maybe people have heard of the ACEs study, right? Adverse childhood experiences and some of these
yeah. Yeah.
markers. So that's one thing to Google if you want to, and just see like, all right, what are some of the things I've been through that may lead to a less desirable effect in my life? And I'm just curious some of the other practical tips or things you might share for folks to bring some more awareness, even if it becomes scary to tell their story. And I was referencing the remote control I've heard when you can almost pretend to have a remote control and press play or pause, rewind, choose not to tell the whole story right now. I've heard that
That's
with
right.
children as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So a couple of different thoughts are coming to mind. One, just piggybacking on the idea of story. Sometimes people will come into my office or other providers' offices and first and foremost, just feeling a deep sense of honor for individuals' willingness to step into a room that they're not certain, like what the person on the other side is going to be like, that sense of bravery. But also the idea that a lot of folks have said, oh man, I thought you were just going to make me like spill my whole story out. Like I thought that's what's going to be session one or day one. And so I often will say like, we always want to move at the speed of trust. And I think, there are various trauma models and trauma therapies, but fundamentally, I think we want to start with the sense of safety and stabilization, like helping people to develop various skills in an individual way that help them to feel like they can navigate through their life more effectively.
Mm.
Then, if necessary, and as part of the work, kind of developing the sense of autobiographical and a coherent narrative. So all of this leads me to think about kind of the principles of trauma informed mindfulness, sort of this intersection, because oftentimes mindfulness is presented and, there are various challenges that we've discussed over time, the concerns about mindfulness being presented a bit as like a panacea. It can be used for everything. It does everything. And I think we want to be cautious and attentive to that, especially in the world of trauma, because again, for most people, like myself included, as I was mentioning earlier in my relationship to mindfulness, mindfulness becomes synonymous with mindfulness of the breath. Eyes closed practice, sitting still, focusing on the breath. A wonderful practice for many, many people. The way I start most of my days as my sort of first practice of the day. And for some, it could be incredibly dysregulated. Asking people to pay quiet, close, sustained attention to their internal experience could be quite dysregulating, meaning it could be having them bump up against old memories, old injuries, old wounds, if you will, emotional and otherwise, that could lead to almost a sense of re-traumatization. So I say all of this from a ideas and practical perspective, if you will, to think about these the fundamental principles of trauma informed mindfulness. And just very quickly, there are 4 R's, and 4R definition that I think helps us to understand trauma informed mindfulness. The first R is realizing the prevalence of trauma. And as you were mentioning, the ACEs study. And for those that don't know, the adverse childhood experiences study that just helps us to get a sense that trauma isn't something that happens like over there to those people. That trauma is something that unfortunately is quite prevalent in our society across all layers and socioeconomic strata and so on. So again, just helping us to really first appreciate that whether we're in a boardroom, a classroom, a yoga room, yoga studio, so on, that the space may hold some amount of trauma and probably does. Holding that lens then of what happened to you, what's the story, I think is one practical sort of idea, just trying to have that question infused into your work. The second R is recognize the symptoms, which I don't want to delve too deeply into right now, but just the idea that there are different types of symptoms. But the real sort of practical tip, if you will, that might stem from that is the idea that when we're working with individuals, including ourselves, trying to recognize quote unquote symptoms as adaptations that our nervous system, our brain, our body, our heart made in an effort to strive and thrive within the world and environment that we're in.
Yes, well, we're all doing our best.
And and that we are these works in progress that are constantly trying to, if you will, shape themselves to navigate as effectively as we can in the world that we're in.
Yes.
So again, this kind of depathologizing one. But then the third R is responding skillfully. So we think about realizing the prevalence, recognize the symptoms. Third R, respond skillfully. And just a couple of ideas related to that. Specifically within the mindfulness, if you will, if we're trying to offer mindfulness practice, one of the ideas is simply to make our language quite invitational. Teachers will often, in a very loving way, but may say like, okay, now let's close our eyes. And for some people, then, wanting to be sort of disciplined practitioner, they, okay, apparently I need to close my eyes for this. And just a very simple modification may be like, in the next few moments, I'll invite you to I'll often say simply to soften your gaze. And this may mean finding a spot 1 or 2 feet in front of your toes, just letting the gaze soften and rest on. Or for some, it may mean letting your eyes fully close. So you just begin via this invitational language to offer the sense of choice, offer the idea that I, the practitioner, still have a sense of autonomy within the practice. And then invitation, choice is infused through all of this. So like having our eyes open or closed, using different objects of attention. So it doesn't simply have to be the breath at the tip of the nose. It could be something external, like sound, for example. Let's focus for the next few months just on the sounds we're hearing in the room, because for some, again, paying deep, close, sustained attention to internal experience may not be inviting. And so all of these ideas of modification or responding skillfully are fundamentally at the core trying to avoid re-traumatization, that fourth R, avoid re-traumatization. So I think if we bring in sort of a heart set and a mindset of invitation and genuineness and acceptance, we'll often say, like in different spaces, you've already done the hardest thing, which is to show up here. Yeah. And then we simply let the practice be the teacher.
Yes, well, the heart set. That is a new term for me that I will be borrowing, if that's okay. Mindset, heart set. Yes, and even as you just started to describe guiding practice there, I felt myself relax a little. Like there was just a little bit of settling for me, and maybe we could just add on a nice 30-minute guided practice if you don't mind, Mom. I know you have to go immediately, but we're already over our time. That's not
If
asking too much.
I would happily do it. And perhaps that, seeing the time, I know our time has been brisk today. Perhaps we can find another time. But
Totally.
yeah, I would love to do that. But you mentioned something so important, right? The idea that all of our sort of sense of knowledge and principles and the 3 E's of trauma, the 4 R's of trauma and for mindfulness. While I think it is important to have some sense of these ideas and the principles, I think it comes down to, as you're saying, kind of a sense again of practice. Because one of my teachers would often say, like, you're not really the mindfulness teacher. The practice is the teacher. You're simply trying to open space and engage in the practice with the community that you're in. So if we continue to allow sort of the practice to be the teacher, I think then we're really embodying in a way some of the idea, theory, philosophy of trauma informed mindfulness. And I think creating a sense of invitation for people to participate. I think a lot of people feel as if mindfulness is something that, like, again, other people do. Like, that's done by people with, eyes closed, living in Santa Barbara under a beautiful tree, with a rainbow behind them, and all of the kind of mythologies get punctured. Well, we really begin to, as you were saying, kind of remember, at its core, what is the practice one of remembering, familiarizing ourselves?
Absolutely, Vamsi. Well, thank you for creating this space for us today. And yeah, it's been really enriching, I want to say. Like, just hearing you speak, it really resonates with me anyway. Just the way that you frame these things and share them. And I feel that invitational language in every sentence that you utter, honestly. And it really creates a beautiful doorway for me. And yeah, it's a good reminder to call you more often so that I can have some more reminders and hopefully, share some in return where it feels useful. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, and apologize. I know we went a little over, but I really appreciate
Oh,
just what you got into there. And yeah, just kind of really a beautiful, both telling your story and then bringing us in kind of more deeply into what you're focused now, knowing we're ultimately only scratching the surface here. But just thank you. So much gratitude, Vamsi.
oh, thank you for the invitation. It's always a gift to be able to sit down with you I know our time was a little short today, but anytime we get to chat is a gift to me. So
Thank you. Take care.
thank you. Thank you again. Great to see you. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Vamsi for that incredible conversation. And thank you for being here with us on the Fresh Perspectives podcast. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, I would be grateful if you'd be willing to take a moment to subscribe, offer any feedback, and share it with a friend if you think they might benefit from listening. Thanks so much for your curiosity. Wishing you courage and compassion. Be well.